District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Things are heating up in the summer. A lot of people are talking about renewables and their current status and viability. We're very critical. I'm very critical of renewables here on the show. And it's not because I'm being paid off by big oil and gas. I wish I was getting money. Just kidding. But renewables have proven to have a very short shelf life. They're not reliable. They are weather dependent. And some argument we try to make here is that they're actually not necessarily good for the environment. And no better person to bring onto the show to talk about this, dive deep further into this subset topic relating to the kind of green questions of renewables, is my friend and colleague, Sarah Montalbano. Sarah is with the Center for the American Experiment, and she's also a senior fellow at my center at the Independent Women's Forum Center for Energy and Conservation. Sarah, I'm really excited for you to break down your new report.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited about it. It's been a fantastic topic to research.
It is titled Shattered Green Dreams, the Environmental Costs of Solar and Wind. And we will go into some of the top line findings that you explain and expand upon in your report. But why isn't this covered? We often see people, especially legacy environmentalists, those who really double down on renewables, tell us there is no trade-off environmentally to their structures. Why do you think that is? Why aren't they honest?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think the main contribution of Shattered Green Dreams here is to recognize that every form of energy generation is coming with its own set of challenges and benefits. There's trade-offs to everything, right? Wind and solar do actually have some trade-offs, especially with the intermittency, the weather dependency, of course, they take a lot of mining of raw materials to create them, manufacturing, construction, and kind of unique to them are large landscape footprints. They have a much higher land use than other forms of electricity generation to produce the same amount of electricity. And there's also lifespan, life cycle costs too in the repowering and recycling. And there's, of course, I think environmental impacts for ecology and habitats. And I think that's really under talked about. So I have to wonder in some ways why these things are sidelined. And I think it's in part just the climate discussions that we have today. They're not, I think, as thoughtful as they could be in really looking for solutions to these kind of things instead of just dogmatically accepting and choosing a particular solution.
Every energy source has trade-offs. And yes, we do see a lot of criticism wielded towards oil and gas, nuclear even, coal especially. Coal is actually interestingly getting a second opinion, not because simply of the energy demand, but also it can be a repository of rare earth elements as we're seeing in Wyoming. And I think as more people recognize that, they may not become opposed to coal, but that's a sidebar note that you can actually find underneath coal deposits, rare earth element deposits side by side. But I want to go into massive land use requirements. It's one of the top line findings of your report here. And everyone talks about, well, the electricity and the energy generated by solar and wind is zero emissions. It's not going to have any impact to the climate. But what people forget is that there is exhaustive behavior going on when you're in the construction phase of all these projects. You're having to drill deep into water aquifers. You're having to destroy essentially or perhaps have an impact physically on landscapes. There could be interruption to wildlife migration patterns and the like. How much in carbon emissions, I don't know if you're able to quantify this, but how much in environmental destruction or carbon emissions even can be quantified by massive land use requirements? Like, what's the environmental toll for wind and solar compared to, let's say, conventional energy, or you can't really quantify by carbon emissions? Has that been established? Can you?
It's a good question. It's very hard to find, I think, credible estimates on carbon emissions, and it was proving a little difficult to figure out. So I don't have any straight answers there. But what I do know is that this land use definitely comes with trade-offs for other worthwhile uses of land, particularly agriculture. Obviously the low electricity density of wind and solar generation. And by that, I mean that they produce a rather low level of electricity and they do so intermittently. It means that you need at least 10 times as much land per unit of power produced as a coal or a natural gas fired power plant. And so that I think is a pretty stark figure. But, the even starker, I think, is comparing it with nuclear because nuclear is so energy dense. A 1 gigawatt capacity nuclear plant, which can power about 750,000 homes, only needs about 1.3 square miles of land area for, the reactor itself. And to produce the same amount of power, a comparable solar installation would need between 45 and 75 square miles. And a wind installation would need between 260 and 3,360 square miles. And that latter figure, because of all the spacing with the wind turbines, they need to be spaced apart from each other so they don't interfere with the air pattern over the blades. That is about Rhode Island and Delaware put together, right? Like to match one nuclear power plant.
That chart is very illuminating, and I like to cite it here on the podcast and in all my writings because it really shows a disparity in terms of land usage and then the electricity output. So nuclear wins out the day when you're comparing those three sources, nuclear versus wind and solar. And even when you're talking about a comparable natural gas plant, and I think even coal plant, I've never heard of a natural gas plant or coal plant using the same amount of land as a wind and solar plant does. And obviously coal and natural gas, especially with sufficient backup power, can be reliable 24/7 or close to that. We haven't seen the same yet of solar and wind because the technology is not there, or it's just the intermittency just makes it impossible for these sources to really have their full potential realized. But I also wanted to mention the wildlife and habitat impacts. We often talk about, everyone has talked about, it's become more mainstream. Like people see, an offshore wind turbine, it disturbs whales. It disturbs, onshore, disturbs endangered birds. It could disrupt sage grouse mating habits. That's actually a study from University of Wyoming, very illuminating stuff. So they even show that there are disturbances from wind turbines, as there could be potentially with conventional energy. I have investigated and seen that even in proposed onshore wind projects, it interrupts migration patterns. Their solar fields are perhaps detrimental to desert tortoise desert tortoise habitat, causes a lot of interruptions there. People do not account for that. You do start to see more government reports acknowledge that, but you could even argue that sometimes like they omit it because it's not very pretty. We have heard about this. I've heard from others, and there are people I know who are doing investigative reports into, how many kill take permits have been issued for endangered whales, like the right whale in the Atlantic, or for golden eagles or bald eagles. Bald eagles are not endangered anymore, but they are still protected under the Migratory Bird Act. Same with golden eagles. They've made successful recovery, but they're still federally protected. So why are they omitting that? Why is the government omitting that? Although I think we might see more transparency there. But I also want you to talk about the limited lifespan and recycling challenges. A lot of people talk great about, okay, this is going to produce cheap, clean, reliable electricity. We have seen so far that it can't deliver that. But also what is very glaringly alarming and clear is that whenever we see these projects pushed, they never give us an end of life plan. Where are these materials or where are the projects and their byproducts going to go when they cease to work? Even not optimally at the 20 years that we're told that they're going to work. They perhaps malfunction sooner. They cease to operate even shorter than promised. We've seen those images of the Sweetwater turbine graveyard in Texas. We've seen a similar field out of Houston, Texas for solar, completely destroyed after a hailstorm. So talk about the limited lifespan and recycling challenges, because so far we have not seen renewable companies tackle that seriously, and then they just waste away in the desert or in a residential area or in a field, and they could produce some toxic elements.
Yeah, I think these are great questions, and tackling the kind of decommissioning and waste problems first. Wind turbines and solar panels are really only warranted for 20 to 25 years. In that I think is pretty stark because when you look at a natural gas or a coal plant, they're operating for 40 years at least. And nuclear, our nuclear fleet is 40 going on 80, right? We have several reactors here in the United States that have just gotten their licenses to operate for 80 years. And so that I think is really important to note because we're compounding the material effects when we have to go in and replace and repair a lot of these structures well before the expected end of life. But also, even if they get there, it's 4 times as often as you need to build a new nuclear plant with all of its steel and concrete, right? And the other important thing on this, and I think this is a really interesting note in this section, due to financial interests like requalifying for the federal production tax credit, which pays developers to generate electricity. The median age for repowering wind turbines in 2023 is only about 11 years, right? So, with their expected end of life in 20 years, they're actually being replaced twice as often as even that in order to take advantage of federal government subsidies. So I think that's a really important point to be making here when we look at these challenges. And of course, batteries have their own host of problems too. All of these technologies have a certain amount of hazardous and toxic chemicals. Disposing of these things is rather expensive compared to just landfilling them. And that's what you see with wind turbine blades is wind turbine blades are mostly fiberglass or carbon fiber. They're difficult and challenging to recycle, and so they end up in landfills for the most part. So, I think recycling can help on some of these issues, but I don't think it's going to be a cure-all for recycling issues and for the need for more raw materials too. Because it's not that we're going to just have this fleet that is continuously recycled back into these electricity, components. It's going to be still adding to demand for new mining for quite a while into the future here.
Let's talk about mining because you have written about kind of the critical minerals question, how getting the minerals for net zero is not possible in a previous report you've done. And I want you to expand on that. But a lot of these materials currently, outside of the discussion we're having here domestically, there is a growing interest. We talked about this before recording that to bring an onshore a lot of this domestic mining here because it could be processed more effectively. There's going to be fewer environmental problems because of just the standards we have here. There's not going to be a question of what type of labor we're using. It's good for the economy. It doesn't mean that you can't trade and export the critical minerals that you produce and refine here elsewhere. It doesn't mean we're not going to trade or have a free market about it. But you talk about what is currently sourced because China owns the processing and refining the majority of that. Currently, the U.S. is trying to combat that with recent initiatives and recent announcements. One to greenlight a new rare earth element mine in Wyoming, the first in 70 years. And then the existing one is going to be partnering with the Department of Defense in a project called 10X facility. And both of those could help, when optimally working and when they're fully commissioned, could help us cut our dependence on China and make us super abundant with respect to critical minerals to give some to our friends to help offset their dependence on China. But currently, as it stands, a lot of these solar panels, wind turbines are sourced by China, who doesn't have good labor practices. They're not very respectful of the environment and manifold problems there. So talk about that component of your report. Why should that be concerning? Because we often hear environmentalists say, no mining here, but we need to have a green transition. But they're fine with importing very poorly sourced critical minerals and rare earth elements from abroad, from questionable sources who don't care about the environment. Why that disconnect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think out of sight, out of mind is a terrible policy for how the U.S. Should be sourcing the minerals it needs. And in our October 2024 report called Mission Impossible, we really talk about the assumptions and demands of net zero and what that would look like for more mining. And we talk a lot about the national security implications there. China does dominate rare earths extraction and processing for all of the rare earths, but a lot of critical minerals too, like copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. China's overseas mining investment hit another peak in 2024 at $21.4 billion. So China is taking this very seriously, and the U.S. has largely abdicating abdicated its mining, frankly, responsibilities to foreign-owned mines in developing countries that don't have high safety standards for workers or high environmental standards. Environmental destruction is destruction anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's happening in Indonesia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We should be concerned about all of these things, and we should be looking to source what we can from domestic sources or allies. Obviously, you can't mine for minerals that aren't here in the U.S., but I think we don't even really know all that's here, and that's in part because exploration on federal lands has stalled out due to a lengthy and litigious permitting process. Frankly, there hasn't been enough geologic mapping to figure out where these initial deposits might be. And if a mining company does want to go in and explore for minerals, it's prohibitively expensive and difficult. So, and that leads to predictable consequences for where we source our minerals overseas. The Department of Labor in 2024 actually, interviewed a bunch of workers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, mining for cobalt, and they found that 44% of those workers could not refuse to do hazardous work, and a majority, 52%, reported children working at their mine site. So I think that's just incredibly important. We're making a value judgment every time we decide that we'd rather offshore a mining project than do it domestically under our high standards.
And we wouldn't have to construct a mine on every corner. That's, of course, exaggeration. That's hyperbole. But I think with a couple facilities away from very environmentally sensitive sites, you can accomplish and produce the 10,000 tons of rare earth critical minerals encompassing rare earth elements that we import annually. That's according to the U.S. Geological Survey. And I'm doing this as I'm trying to prepare for reports, and we've talked about this, and you've done extensive great work on this as well. But we can meet our need with maybe 5 facilities, like if they're constructed within the next few years and within the next 2 to 3 years, or if they could be expedited and built quicker. We do see this Brook mine in Wyoming possibly maybe asking and requesting expediting rather of approval. But they broke ground, and maybe they'll be able to speed up construction with some of the new parameters from the administration that they've put with permitting reform that only judge, direct environmental impacts, not the secondary or tertiary indirect, direct emissions, because that stuff is convoluted. That's done to derail projects that could actually usher in a so-called clean energy future or progress. But we do start to see more and more people come around to realize that we do need to bring this back here. And it's not because of a protectionist notion. Some people might believe that for protectionist reasons. I don't. I think it's for, the benefit of us to be critical mineral independent, much like we're trying to attain with energy independence. And we can do things a lot better than the rest of the world. That doesn't mean, like you said, we're not going to work with countries. Like we also import rare earth elements from Malaysia. I think Japan is the third, and then Estonia is the fourth, actually. So wherever we can't fulfill the need, if we have friends and allies, and I'm not saying like Malaysia is an ally, I don't know our posture with Malaysia, but I'm saying that they're probably not as questionable as China. So we can, wherever we can't successfully onshore, we would work with countries that hopefully have the same standards as us. Estonia and Japan certainly do, probably on par with us. So we can look to countries like that. But yeah, that's kind of like the elephant in the room. with a lot of these green proponents, they're like, well, we can't do projects here because they specifically talked about different projects in Alaska. They're very critical of the Twin Metal mines in Minnesota. I'm
Yes.
not sure if Twin Metals is going to have their permit renewed. I haven't seen much discussion there. But you could accomplish a lot of this with existing mines like that one in California where there is
Mhm.
this one in Wyoming, and then perhaps a couple others. And again, environmental quality would be very attended to. They
Mhm.
wouldn't get approval for the project if not. And they would have to prove under the new permitting reform standards, like they won't carte blanche destroy the environment. And they know that if they do, it won't. And Twin Metals Mine actually put out a plan saying that like we have carbon neutrality, like we're going to abide by carbon neutrality, which still doesn't get you in their good graces even if
Mhm.
you're trying to play their game. But they were promising, even the Twin Metal Mines, as I was researching, that they promised to have a very limited footprint if their project were to be scaled up or to come online. So
Yeah.
they're not going to go into this and say we're going to pollute the rivers intentionally. Like
Mhm.
we don't operate like that anymore. The criticism that they would receive would be manifold, very toxic,
Right.
and all that.
Yeah.
So they know that like with production comes actual conservation, and a lot of these
Mhm.
companies, mining, nuclear, coal, oil, gas, even though they're vilified often, they
Mhm.
do a lot actually locally to help with pollinators, habitat restoration, and the like.
Absolutely.
We've documented this at IWFCEC, you and I
Yeah.
both. So we know that that's possible, but you
Mhm.
don't see the same scrutiny. And like we said, trade offs, every project has to have them, will have them. You can
Mhm.
balance them out and you can weigh them equally. But we have to apply the same scrutiny to the so called green technologies as well, and maybe even greater because they get off the hook. They can get a discount, as you've documented at our center very well. They were getting
Mhm.
80% discount on public land bid leasings,
Mhm.
leasing bids, which is not criminal in my in but I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, but I'm trying to think like it's egregious that they were getting
Mhm.
discounts, not that same accountability, and even far more environmental concerns with their projects kind of slipped out the window because they were the favored industry of the last administration, for example.
Right.
So
And
Sarah,
yeah.
rounding out our conversation, what would you like to offer in our time remaining, some other takeaways from the report that we haven't already hammered yet?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things about mining in the U.S. is that, the people who work at these mines live and work and play in these communities. They really understand that, to steward our environment carefully and protectively is the most important thing to them. So, I really love to see very responsible modern mining in the United States. I think all of the projects that we've seen, like the ones you've talked about, have been very responsible, and we'll have to see what's going on at the federal level for specific projects. But there is a bill that was introduced by Pete Stauber, who is a representative up in the Iron Range of Minnesota, to actually codify some of the administration's executive orders around mining. It's HR 4090 for anyone interested. And, it will speed geologic mapping on federal lands. It includes a mapping directive that I think will be very helpful in actually exploring some of these areas for minerals and figuring out what we have in the United States. It also asks the Secretary of the Interior to identify burdensome federal regulations. And that I think will be a very wide net. Obviously, it includes things like permitting reform, but I'm sure the mining industry has some other ideas about what their practical hurdles and roadblocks have been. So I'm very excited to see what's going on at the federal level. There's, I think, a lot of excitement around, actually being able to bring some mining home to the United States and to see what we can do on our own lands under our high standards.
It really is a very interesting time, and we will see that quality and attention awarded to, public lands. There's been,
Mhm.
of course, a lot of discussion during reconciliation about public lands and sales and whatnot. But as we saw in the first Trump administration, it's not me, speaking, trying to gloat and praise them, heap praises. But I was impressed by the first Trump administration. We're going to see this, I think, in the second, that even though they were approving more projects, this they're doing even in a more expeditious fashion, quicker, really reforming permitting reform and all the other NEPA and all the other derivative laws. Even as you start to see that there will still be that same environmental quality. And even if they're not publicly stating it, behind the scenes that they are, and they do respond to public comment and public opinion. So if they feel like they're deficient in the conservation area, they will start to focus on that. Like in my interactions with the admin so far, they're very receptive to criticism or, wanting to see more attention here. But you hear in the posture that they say that, even as we scale up these projects, even as we approve these projects or want to see more energy infrastructure or drilling or mining or plugging or what have you, they still emphasize that there will not be a despoiling of the air, water, and accompanying lands because we don't have to. And as we start to see this abundance or superabundance language and movement build about, people are recognizing, and actually a Gallup poll, Sarah, if you don't know this, found that more Americans on a bipartisan plurality, I think it was 54%. I forget if it was this. I think it was this year in the a Gallup poll asking people to weigh in on Trump policies so far relating to the environment and energy. It found that a plurality, I think it was 54, 55%, said that you can approve more energy projects without, or you can deregulate while still seeing improved air, water, land quality. I was very surprised in a good way to see that. So I think people are understanding that those things are not at odds with one another. As you deregulate, as you approve more projects, that doesn't lead to an accompanying despoiling or destruction of the environment. So if even Democrats and centrists, in addition to Republicans, are seeing that, so I think these efforts are breaking through more. People realize, like, why would I trade first world living for nature? I don't have to put those two interests in opposition to one another.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. NEPA was never intended to be kind of the big protection act that I think it has kind of morphed into. It's always been intended, it's right there in the name. It's a policy act. It's a procedural act. And, I think this administration is really, and a recent Supreme Court case decision, have really started to restore NEPA to its proper role. And when it's back to being just the procedure and the paperwork, and we're able to figure out a way to do these things without undue environmental impacts or harm, I think we see that these projects can go a lot faster. And I think the most responsible and plugged in mining and all of these other projects, frankly, are actively and frequently soliciting public feedback. You will never be able to have a happy relationship in a community where you're not wanted, right? I've spent some time around people in the mining industry now, and all of them are incredibly proud to be doing this right in the United States and to be doing it under incredibly high standards. They live in these communities and they want the best for the environment.
They do, and there's no greater evidence of this than in Alaska.
Yes.
When we were filming up there and you were part of our Tongass report, like, I got to meet the Alaska Mining Association folks, and you see no greater champions of conservation than them, because, like, they hunt and fish. They also work in the mining industry. Those two ideas and thinkings are not at odds with one another. So people have to go to Alaska to see that things are not as they seem with respect to this. Like
exactly.
A lot of stereotypes are broken when you go to places like Alaska or even Florida too. I think there's similar posturing there, but Alaska, you want to change your perspective, or you get too comfortable being a lower 48er, go to Alaska and you see that the dynamic is very different, but in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every Alaskan I've ever met who's done, oil drilling on the North Slope, they're incredibly proud of doing it right. What I've heard, and I don't have firsthand evidence of this, so if it's misinformation in some way, please correct me. But what I have heard is that to keep even a single drop of oil from dripping from the underside of a car onto the tundra, they wrap it up in sort of a diaper. They
Wow.
keep that off the landscape, and they really try to minimize their environmental impacts up there. So apologies if that is somehow incorrect, but that is what I've heard. And I think that's just emblematic of the attitude up there is, no, we love this place. We want to keep our hunting and recreation opportunities. We want to keep our beautiful nature. And that's what they do. Even one drop of oil doesn't make it past them.
That is very true. That's the first I've learned of it, but we will follow up to see if that is. Sarah, you don't put up misinformation. So I think there's some great.
I try not to. Yes.
All right, everyone. Sarah, thank you for being on the show. We will link to all the reports, your social media accounts. Really appreciate you coming on. And I hope people check out both your most recent report and the one about critical minerals not leading to a net zero path. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
As to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.